During February of 2024, to escape the stress of my daily life, I decided to treat myself. First, by going to Ridgeland, South Carolina, and having a delicious king cake latte. Then I decided to drive to Wormsloe for their annual colonial fair and muster. As a bonus, when I arrived at Wormsloe, I discovered that admission on Sunday was free. While I had no idea of what to expect, other than the impressive gate featured on their online advertisement, I was astonished to find a 1.5-mile path lined with spectacular live oaks, which made a canopy draped with Spanish moss. After doing some research at home, I found that the gate was not constructed until the 1890s and was done as a French custom to celebrate the birth of the then owner's son. In addition, the grand drive was not always so impressive. In fact, during the colonial period, the road was flanked by crops. In reality, it wasn't until after the Civil War that these oaks were planted to give the family's home a country cottage feel. However, today, the trees hearken to mind the Old South, which is appropriate as this road leads towards the site of Georgia's oldest plantation. During my day at Wormsloe, I did everything possible except for the 3-mile hike. During this vlog, I will be showing what I saw while visiting Wormsloe, as well as reviewing the family's history. The history of this place is actually older than Georgia itself, which was established in 1732 as the last of the 13 colonies to be founded. While there are several reasons why Georgia was formed, it was mainly created as a buffer between the important colony of South Carolina and the Spanish in Florida. In order to make Georgia more inviting to English Christian settlers, the colony originally prohibited the import of rum and slaves. In addition, there was also a 500-acre limit per settler. Among the first 40 families to arrive aboard the Anne to try and settle the untamed land of Georgia was John Noble, his wife Sarah, his sister Mary, his 2 children, and 2 indentured servants. When the family arrived to Georgia's Island of Hope, it was 1733. While it is documented that Noble Jones was a middle-class man, because of his intelligence, he quickly became a very important member to the new settlement. In fact, he proved to be a very skilled doctor and carpenter. In addition, he also got along quite well with the indigenous people in the area and helped to establish relationships with them. By 1736, Jones established his 500-acre plantation, which he named Wormsloe after his ancestral homeland. Interestingly, on this land was a 3-story high pile of oyster, crab, and snail shells, which were piled high along the banks. These shells had been discarded over generations by the indigenous peoples who had once called this land home. In fact, these shells are what Jones used to build his tabby home, which also had fort-style walls. The construction of Jones' Tabby Fort House took from 1739 to 1745. Upon its completion, the surrounding walls were 8 foot high. The fort house was 1.5 stories and had 5 rooms. Jones built the home in this way because of the amount of materials readily available to him, and to protect his family against the Spanish and anyone else who would try to harm them. Later, Jones served as a constable, royal counselor, and surveyor. He even drew up the plans for Augusta. Jones himself even took part in the Greater War of Austrian Succession. In doing so, he went with the English to raid along the St. Johns River in northern Florida in 1740, as well as defending Frederica at the Battle of Bloody Marsh in 1742. In addition, by 1752, Jones was charged with organizing a group of men to protect the coast. This is because Jones's house was located on Skidaway Narrows, and every ship on its way to Savannah would have to pass by his watchful Marines, who were armed with muskets, a swivel gun, a cannon, and 2 scout boats. By 1749, as laws began to change in Georgia, Jones started using slave labor in order to make Wormsloe profitable. While doing so, he tried his hand at growing corn, rice, fruits, vegetables, and indigo. Eventually, Jones was able to acquire 5,500 acres, as well as 5 town lots in Savannah. Before his death, Jones served in multiple civic capacities as a judge, militia captain, and legislator. In regards to his family life, Noble Jones and his wife Sarah had 14 children, all of whom survived to adulthood except for one. When Jones finally passed away, it was at the beginning of the American Revolution. After Noble Jones' death in 1775, Wormsloe passed to his daughter Mary Jones Bullock. While Noble Jones had been a loyalist, his son Noble W. Jones was a staunch patriot. In fact, N.W. Jones led the Georgia Commons House in the rejection of the Townshend Acts, and took part in a mission that seized gunpowder from the Provisional Magazine in 1776. After N.W. Jones's sister passed in 1795, the Wormsloe plantation went to him, after which he deeded the plantation to his son George Jones. George, like his father and his grandfather, was also very political and served as a U.S. Senator and in various roles of government in Savannah. During George Jones's ownership, the plantation began to produce cotton, and in 1828 he built a new, more elaborate house, which is still standing today. Eventually, George Jones's son, George Frederick, inherited the plantation in 1853. During George Frederick's ownership, he changed the spelling of the plantation from Wormslow to Wormsloe. He also enlarged the gardens, added the oak-lined avenue, and expanded the house. During the Civil War, after the Union captured Savannah, George Frederick and his family were forced to leave, and the plantation was seized. During this time, and during Reconstruction, the family stayed in Europe until President Andrew Johnson reinstated the property to the family. Interestingly, George Franklin didn't give the property to his son, but rather placed it into a trust for his grandson, who was also named George. Interestingly, during the life of the new owner, George W., he would change his last name from Jones to DeRene in order to gain privacy, distinction when traveling abroad, and so he would stop receiving letters meant for other relatives. While George W. owned the property, he had the bodies of his relatives removed and reinterred at a very popular cemetery so that they would not be forgotten. After George W., the plantation then went to his son Wimberly, who began a dairy operation. During the Great Depression, Wimberly's sister Elfrida took over her brother's debts and began to live on the plantation. By 1970, in a way to avoid paying taxes on the property, it was transferred to the state. Then, in 1979, it was opened to the public as a historic site. However, even today, Noble Jones descendants have control of the house and the acreage.
The higher class women that are wearing really fancy gowns in the summertime may have linen mitts with some embroidery on them because they don't want to get tanned. Wooden clogs. Normally you would take a piece of sheepskin with the fur still on it and tack it down here and then fold it in so it covers your toes and comes all the way to the back, and then you could take that out and launder it, but it gives you padding here and on the bottom of the foot. Our shoes, that's the one that buckles horribly.
Would you guys like to learn how?
They have strange buckles. So we have the two tongues, and the buckle has one set of prongs here, so that one stays in. You push that piece down, pull it through the other side of the buckle, and then buckle this side. So it's kind of a really odd system. So these are made out of a linen canvas, and they're boned with basket reed. So after you put on your stays, you put on your pocket. Your pocket is a separate piece. So there's a nursery rhyme about Lucy Locket losing her pocket. And when I was a kid, it was like, how in the heck do you lose your pocket? Well, if your pocket is tied on separately, you can lose it. So women of this time are having babies an awful lot. So the way your stays are made, each individual section is finished and then they're whip stitched together, so you can actually take your stays apart and add another section for pregnancy. And with something like this, where you're tying at the waist, you can also make adjustments for pregnancy, so you don't have. So to make this go around the neck better, you just kind of make a few little tucks at the neckline, place it around the neck. My favorite way to wear it is to now tuck that into the waistband, and then I put on the upper layer, and this is called a short gown, and it's very simply made. If I fold it into quarters, you can see that better. Okay, so, okay, there is a quarter of it. So there's a fold here and there's a fold here. So basically you're cutting this shape, and this is your side seam and your underarm seam. Then you slash it up the front, cut the neckline out. You take in the back a little bit.
I'm scraping a piece of flint across the frizzen here, and this pops open. This pops open, and then the flint strikes off steel that gets scraped down into here. And so ultimately what I want is sparks to fall into this pan, because that's where all the powder is, that are being scraped off. And the pieces of metal are so small that the energy it takes to scrape it off is enough energy to heat it up enough to catch on fire. That's actually what's happening. You're scraping off pieces of metal that are so small that the energy raises the temperature, and with the oxygen in the air, it instantly ignites. So it's little bits of burning metal that you're scraping off. And so you can see right here, there's a scrape going down the face, and that's where the metal is being scraped off. But it also means you have to have a very hard metal. If this was soft, then when I scrape it with the flint, it doesn't take as much energy to scrape a piece of metal off. So it doesn't raise the temperature enough, so it doesn't make a spark. There are plenty of reports of the soldiers' guns being in abysmal states of repair. And very similarly, I have seen plenty of guns in abysmal states of repair, which is actually why I wrote this. This book is for reenactors. It's a how-to guide for operating and cleaning and maintaining and troubleshooting flintlocks in an 18th century way.
So is that a brown bess?
This is a brown bess, yes.
It's a good guess, because that's the only gun I know of that they had then.
There's only two that are typically seen at Rev War reenactments. So there's the brown bess, and then there's the charlatan.
Okay. So is there a big difference between the two, or not really?
Well, in the sense that they are both flintlock muskets, so they both have really similar looking locks. There are some differences. So for example, this is a model 1770. So this is a model 1763 or 66 Charleville. So right away you can see that the locks are pretty similar. There's a few small differences. This one, it's called a gooseneck cock. So you just have this sort of gooseneck that comes back. There we go. You set the end in a bucket of water up to this hole, and then you'll take your ramrod and you'll put something called a worm on it, which is this, and then to that I will put some tow, which is this. So I wrap this tow around the worm, wrap it all up around there, and that is basically a patch. Then I would take this with the barrel in a bucket of water, I would have it on my ramrod, and I would draw it down and then pull it up, and I just made a giant syringe. And so you're just going to pump water out into this bucket and pull it up, and you're just shooting water in and out through the barrel in order to clean it, because the black powder fouling, pretty bad.
So which one did the militia use? Like
whatever they could get their hands on.
Okay.
Typically, you'll see militia with more brown bess style muskets, because that's just what they were used to. And the French-style muskets were coming from overseas, so we were importing these. Eventually we started to make these, but it took a while for us to figure out the manufacturing techniques to make these bands, to make this lock, because all the dies that we had were set up. We were casting brass furniture instead of forging iron furniture.
Oh. And then my last question, I promise, is when did the American Patriots start using bayonets? We didn't start originally, did we? Wasn't that something that happened later?
There were plenty of units that were required to have edged weapons, and a lot of them did have edged weapons. And a lot of the stores that we stole from state armories at the beginning of the war had bayonets, but we weren't fully equipped with them. We wanted to have bayonets, but we just didn't have enough for everybody.
Right.
So, you know, we started making them, we started shipping them in. By 77, a lot of soldiers have bayonets, but it was a constant struggle to keep everybody armed, because as soon as we would go through a campaigning season, everybody's enlistments would expire, and then they'd all go walk off with all their weapons and gear, and now we got to start over.
Right.
So by 77, 78, the Continental Army was starting to get their supply base finally functioning, finally working, but it took a while. And then we were using imports from the French and other countries to kind of take up the slack. But the problem, so one of the problems with these bayonets will only fit the musket that they are made for. There's some standardization, but not a lot. So this is a Brown Bess musket, this is my bayonet, fits pretty well. This is somebody else's Brown Bess musket. We'll see if it fits. Okay, happens to fit. There you go, Charlottesville. Now, Charlottesville musket. So now I get a bunch of muskets shipped in by the French, and let's say I've got a bunch of old Brown Besses that are, the locks are crap, the guns are rusted out, the locks are, or the stocks are broken. Now I want to try and fit Brown Bess bayonets onto Charlottesville muskets. Well, that's not going to work. So,
this is where I would keep, for me, I would keep my...
Is that a deer horn?
Yep. This is part deer antler. That's deer antler. This is, I'm a rifleman, so I have to have a couple different things in the musket, guys. So I have a little knife here, called a patch knife. This is how I measured my powder. These guys have paper cartridges that have the bullet in it and the powder already pre-measured, and they have a black bag that they carry it in. I have my powder in a horn, and I have my own measure. So I put the powder in here, and then I pour it down in there. And then I put my bullet, I put a bullet, piece of cloth on here and a bullet on that, and I start it with this. I put this away. It's a long process. Now that's hanging on my shoulder. I take that, and then I take this out and run it all the way down. Now I have marks on here to tell me when it's fully seated. So when the bullet is all the way packed down. Because if it's not packed down, if I don't do it right, it could blow up in my face, which would be bad. Then I put that away, and then I can go shoot. Now, when these shoot, this is what's called safety, right? So it does not shoot. There's no powder here. This pan here, this little spot here, when I get ready to shoot, as they're going to do in a little bit, they'll put powder in here. You see that little hole?
yeah,
See a little hole in there? See this? There's a hole right there, right? Okay.
They didn't have toms back then. I don't know if you can you guys that.
Powder here, when it ignites, sends a little flame in there, which ignites the powder that's in here behind the ball when it shoots. So you put powder here, and I don't have any powder, this is not loaded. You close this. Now watch what happens when this piece of rock hits this metal. Pull this back all the way. It doesn't do anything. See those sparks? One spark. The regimental blues are the South Carolina 2nd Regiment of the Continental Line. Each state enlisted people for Continental Line units and state militia units. A state militia person would wear something more like this with the same hat. So you have 2nd South Carolina State Militia and 2nd South Carolina Continental Line. Now the state militia is today's National Guard.
This is a Brown Bess musket.
Musket fired, cover your ears. Musket fired, cover your ears.
Fire.
Musket fired, cover your ears.
Fire.
We're portraying the Georgia, South Carolina Provincial Navy.
Oh, okay.
And the scout boats during the War of Jenkins here were based here out of Wormsloe.
Oh, really?
Yeah. How we doing? We've got surgery's packing up, yeah. But we have navigation, and we have weapons and ship's tools, and we can discuss anything you like in those areas. 1st century grenade launcher.
Okay.
What do you put in it?
A grenade.
Yeah.
Really?
Yep.
Oh, how cool is that?
Now I can send that about 100 yards away.
Okay.
Neat.
A little better than running up and throwing it.
Yeah.
I like it a lot. Here, may I? That is so
Cool. It's the throwing version, right?
Yeah.
really.
Same thing, just a little bit larger.
Fascinating.
And what about the shorter piece there?
That's a blunderbuss.
Okay.
The Dutch word dunderbus, which is thunderpipe.
Okay.
Basically an 18th century shotgun.
Yeah.
You know why the flare is on there? Any guesses?
Why the
The flare in the
Like, why does it flare at the end? So that it will spray more, whatever?
Yeah.
For ease of loading.
Oh.
Because these are also called a carriage gun sometimes.
Okay.
If you're on shipboard on a pitching deck,
Yeah.
or you're bouncing around in a carriage and a highwayman is coming your way,
Yeah.
and you need to load this, it's a lot easier to hit this hole than it is that one.
Right. Yeah. The original comics.
Right. The indentured servants and the prisoners from the London jails, which really, there weren't that many of them by the time, you know, but nobody else wanted to come to Georgia either. Who wants to come to a place when you can't get spirits?
Yes. But,
Or hire a lawyer?
but the whole first part of this is when he became he was a commissioner of prisons or whatever in England.
Yeah.
So he was trying to reform the prison.
So when people would travel, like when a blacksmith would travel, how would he take all this stuff with him? I mean, did he just use like a carriage and put everything in there? Or?
There were portable forges, mostly farriers. Is that for Nathan?
Okay.
I'm going to put the cornbread here.
Okay.
But it's a lot like pipe fitters now. They'll have a small forge and a small anvil and vise on the back of their truck, just kind of mounted on there. So if you ever see a Reading big utility truck with all the toolboxes, and you see a vise on the back of it, there's probably a pipe fitter, and he probably has blow torches to heat stuff up and do tiny adjustments. You'd have a wagon that would have all this equipment in it. A portable forge would basically be a bowl, a fire pot, and a portable bellows that you can just stand up and start pumping.
So I guess a lot of I know there's not like a lot of blacksmith around anymore, but like an anvil, that really hadn't changed a whole lot. So if you're buying equipment to do a reenacting or something, like anvil is pretty much the same as today.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The shapes are slightly different depending on region and country and use. So this is more of a utility anvil. It can do a little bit of everything. Cultures that have more horseshoeing, you'll have kind of a second horn on the other side, and this horn, instead of being long and pointed, will be a little shorter and stubbier like that.
Okay.
And that's because that creates a better horseshoe shape. That's more of a farm anvil, where you need to shoe horses, and it's just a single big block. You see this has two different holes. That's a hardy hole. You have tools that drop in there, little attachments to do extra work. So this is if I need a tiny horn, I can use that. Or if I'm making small rings, I can use this to hammer the ring round. And you pull that out, put a different tool. The most common ones are a hardy cut tool, where it's a wedge block that you use to hammer and cut through your metal. So this is called a bick. So every anvil generally is going to have a hardy hole, a hole that you can put additional temporary tools in. My other favorite tool is this. It's just a hold down tool. If I'm working by myself and I need to hold something down to work on it, I set that on it. I got a piece of metal here that if I'm working something like this and it's hot, I get that seated in place, give it a quick hammer, and that'll seat in real tight, and squish against it, and I can work on it. Now it's going to be smaller materials generally, but that'll hold what I'm doing right there. and won't let it bounce around, or if I have to, if I need a third hand, it's there.
Right.
I actually, I have a separate one that's a little smaller, and it kind of has a spring to it. Other tools are kind of like it's called a fuller, and it's basically a piece that comes up and it has a spring with 2 round bars on it. So when you hammer it, it pinches top and bottom, and using that you can kind of, like rolling Play-Doh, you roll one spot skinny while you leave the rest wide. And that's handy for like arrowheads, or sometimes you need to take a material smaller than it is, but evenly. It's a technique called necking. You squeeze a neck into your piece of material. Like arrowheads, like you said.
No, it's butter as well.
Well, butter can be. Well, that's
This right here,
Oh, okay.
the Backcountry Housewife, and that was here in the library at Wormsloe, in the staff library. But it's got recipes and the stories behind the recipes. Yeah. So like I try to plan what we're going to cook with what would have been available at that time of year.
Right.
And then I plan different dishes based on, you know, do I want to cook, you know, high class today, or do I want to cook, you know, from, you know, African dishes,
Right.
you know, rice and beans and things that would have been,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, when I went to buy my dress, I was like, I'm going to be rich in my fake life. And then I saw the prices. I was like, I'm going to be poor in my fake life, too.
Blow your match well. Prepare to give fire. Gun number 1, give fire. Gun number 2, give fire. Gun number 3, give fire. Times for our volunteer cannoneers. Please join me. Hip, hip.